All right, beautiful. So we're actually starting the final fifth book of the Torah today, and historically there wasn't necessarily five books. What was passed down from Moses, from Moshe to the people was just one unified organic book that just, flowed into each other. There's certainly clear topics and sections, but the idea of breaking them down into different weekly readings, that developed under the rabbi, and then the idea of chapters and verses, that happened much later historically, I believe under Christian publishers, but regardless, it's actually quite helpful today. But practically speaking, we're in the fifth book, and there's something very unique about what's happening in Devarim, which is from the word devar, which can mean either speech or literally a thing. Like I'm holding a dvar, a thing in my hand, or I'm speaking daber, to speak. And this is Moshe's final speech to the people. So they've been wandering for about 40 years at this point, and Moshe has learned that he's not going to go into the land of Israel. So this is his final opportunity to speak to the people, both to review the law, so that they can, review it for themselves before they go in the land, remember what they're going into the land for, why they're going in the land, what they're meant to do there. And he's also reviewing some of the mistakes that he made as a leader and the people made. We'll see in a moment in the summary, it talks about the sin of the scouts, the spies going into the land that led to wandering for 40 years. And what's interesting, we're not going to go into so much depth today, but in the original, back a number of weeks ago, in the original accounting of it, God said to Moses, if you want to send scouts or spies into the land of Canaan, go for it, but you don't have to. And it was ultimately Moshe's choice. And in this recounting, Moshe says to the people, it was your fault. You told me to do it. And that's a really interesting, there's no clear answer for that. Why does Moshe turn it around at this point? Is he trying to criticize the people and say, I wouldn't have done it if I didn't think that you as the people needed it? So even though technically, yes, I'm the one who said we should do it, I did it because you were questioning me left and right, and I thought that was the best way to get your loyalty, as it were. So whenever there's a story told twice in the Torah and it's told differently, there's always so much going on there. And this beginning of Moshe's speech is a lot of review of what's happened so far. And then he'll launch into, and again, the entire book is essentially his speech saying, where did we come from? How did we get here? And where are we going? And it's quite beautiful. And many people say, if you're only going to read one book of the Torah, read Devarim, because in many ways it's a summary of the entire book of the Torah. And while it's clear that God accepts it and it's part of our law, the rabbis do recognize that this book is unique and that Moshe is coming up with everything to say, and God's putting a stamp of approval, as opposed to some of the earlier books where it was God saying to Moshe, say this and do this. And it comes out in some very unique ways, even in practical Jewish law, where Moshe says something in this book, and it doesn't have the same power impact necessarily as the earlier books. So what we're going to do is, actually there's a news source, I think it's Torah.org, and I brought their slightly longer, but not too long summary that we'll go through. And then we're gonna look at one interesting topic in this week's Torah reading, and then we'll read a brief summary of the Haftorah, which is special for this week because of the coming holiday of Tisha B'Av. So what I'm going to do is, Shannon, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And I think you have to unmute yourself on your side. And if you would please read in English the summary for the first and second aliyot and again, the aliyot are the 7 different, we take the weekly reading and break it into 7 different parts. And these are the first and second parts. They just, squished them together. So go for it. Moshe recounts.
Okay. Moshe recounts the history of the 40 years after the request by the people to send the spies. Pasuk 12 is read to the tune of Ika Lamentations. He notes the establishment of the Sanhedrin and the judicial system.
Excellent, thank you. So one of the things in the beginning, it said the second Luchot. In Hebrew, it's the tablets that Moshe smashed when he came down the second time down the mountain in his anger. And an important thing here that's we're coming up next week, the 9th of the month of Av, when we remember the destruction of the 2 temples. And one of the special works that we as a congregation are actually going to read together is the Book of Lamentations, Eicha, which was very likely written by Yirmiyahu, and it's just this incredibly painful work about the destruction of the temple and the fall of Jerusalem, Yerushalayim. And there's a special melody for that book, Lamentations, and that makes it even into the weekly reading. So Halavai, it would be wonderful if we're in shul this week and everyone would see that in real time. But it's interesting how, different traditions can creep up and affect things in different places. Shannon, since that was so short, do you mind just taking the summary for the third and fourth aliyot as well, please? The incident of the Meraglim, which is spies.
The incident of the Meraglim, spies, and its terrible punishment is related. Remember, the sin of the spies and the decree for that generation to die out in the desert occurred today, on Tisha B'Av, 2449, 3,266 years ago.
Excellent. So one of the things is that I believe that this week's reading, the beginning of the book of Deuteronomy, Devarim, always falls out right before Tisha B'Av. I don't know if that's ever not true, but everything I saw, it usually falls out. So you can see here that this summary was written to reflect that. And one of the important things is that historically, we associate the 9th of the Jewish month of Av with more than just the destruction of the first temple, but also the second temple and multiple other great tragic moments that happened to our people, including the sin of the spies. Meraglim is really more scouts. They weren't like proper spies like they were in the book of Joshua. But again, their sin, which we talked about, really did they sin? But ultimately they said, we're not ready to go in the land of Israel, which destroyed the morale of the people. And God decreed that they would spend 40 years wandering around and for a whole generation to die off until a new generation who could be essentially born free would be brave enough and strong enough to go into the land. And even if they hadn't sinned, that probably was a good practical strategic plan anyways, to have a bunch of people who don't know what it means to be a unified people. You need a generation of freedom who can form a military, who can know what it's like to be unified behind one cause. But regardless, that moment was so destructive to our people because God wanted us to go in the land of Israel that we mark that also on the 9th of the month of Av. So Jane, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, and I'll have you take 5, 6, and 7. So go ahead, Jane, for the 5th and 6th. Yes.
Okay. Moshe jumps 38 years during which the decree of the 40 years was carried out and focuses on Israel's encounter with the nations of Esav, Moab, and Ammon. The battles with Sichon and Og and the acquisition of Transjordan are retold.
Excellent. So meaning jumping 38 years is he basically summarizes what happened with the Meraglim, the scouts, and then he jumps historically in talking about all the battles that they just fought, because there were battles that they fought while they were in the wilderness, other nations that were afraid of them, that didn't want them to survive to make it to the land of Israel. Obviously under Joshua, the book of Joshua, Yehoshua, they'd have many more battles, but they had quite a few at this point, and thank God, literally, they were quite successful. We're going to actually focus on that Og, on that particular character. But what's interesting is a lot of these nations like Esav and Moab, they're cousins. They might be distant cousins, but many of the nations that we battled that were our greatest enemies were related to us through some of our early ancestors through Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov and Jacob. Go ahead, Jane, the 7th Aliyah summary.
Transjordan is given to the 2.5 tribes, and Yehoshua is encouraged to view these victories as a promise of future success in taking land.
Excellent, thank you. And Transjordan meaning the land that's right outside of the land of Israel, i.e. on the other side of the Jordan, which they're about to cross through. And I think we learned a bit about that in the previous week where Moshe, thinking that people were rebelling again, like with the sin of the spies, these 2.5 tribes said, we don't want to go in, we want to settle here. And this whole back and forth where Moshe ultimately, I think that was my Dvar Torah, actually the other week, where Moshe convinces them to go into the land, or they offer to go into the land and fight the battle until the land is settled, and then they'll go back and settle outside of the land in Tinak, or wherever they're going to end up. So a lot of very powerful things. And again, the book of Devarim, because it's a summary, and some have even called it the Mishnah Torah, the repetition of the Torah, the repetition of the first 4 books in many ways. Every week coming up is going to be so powerful. It's going to have poetry. It's going to review some of the most important laws and the history. And we're going to see Moshe's humanity here. There's a beautiful book by Rabbi Tzvi Grumet, who before the pandemic, we were going to bring out, and hopefully we can in the future, but regardless, he's written at least two incredible books. One is on the book of Genesis, Bereshit, but the other one is this incredible book on the development of the leadership of Moses. It goes through all of the major incidents in his life and talks about how he develops as a leader, both of his faults and what he learns from them. So even though we don't have that book in front of us, hopefully a lot of what I picked up from that book will come out here in the book of Devarim, Deuteronomy. So before we jump into our first section, I'll pause. And if anyone has a question, just throw up your hand and I can unmute you. And then again, at the end, welcome Tamar. And whoever joined on phone as well. Beautiful. Okay, so Gloria and Leonard, I'm going to unmute you. And this first section here is very interesting. It mentioned in the summary that Moshe is going to talk about some of the nations that we defeated, and specifically is going to focus on this character, the king of this nation, Bashan, Og. Now, it does say a little bit about this man, and we're going to actually see a description of the battle, and then a very weird is the best way to describe it, weird description of this king, Og. And one of the things that we're going to do here is we talk about midrash, again, rabbinic stories on the text to fill in gaps, to add depth, to add meaning, whether it's in moralistic teachings, etc. But oftentimes the midrashim, they take a text that's pretty simple and straightforward, and then they go off and do very creative things with it. But what happens when you have a text that's just weird to begin with, and you kind of need to be creative to figure out what on earth is going on? And that's what we're going to see here. We're going to see rabbis that usually say, I'm going to be very rational and literal about the text and not deal with midrashic wild stories, but they read something and they say, this is pretty wild to begin with. So first, just a description of the battle, which is spoken about twice in this week's Parsha. So Gloria, go ahead, Devarim 3:1-3. Then we turned, and he's describing the battle that already happened at this point.
Then we turned and went up the way of Bashan, and Og, the king of Bashan, came forth towards us, he and all his people, to war at Edrei. And the Lord said to me, do not fear him, for I have given him all his people and his land into your hand, and you shall do to him as you did to Sihon, the king of the Amorites, who dwelt in Heshbon. So the Lord our God delivered into our hands also Og, the king of Bashan, and all his people, and we smote him until no remnant remained of him.
Excellent, thank you. So that's a very common trope, is when we win a battle, and both in that we believe this religiously, but also experientially, they recognize that when they won a battle, it's because God allowed them to win and, sent the enemy into their hands. So that's a pretty straightforward description of this defeating this Og of Bashan, and oftentimes they describe a people they conquered by their king, not always, but very typically. We have Balaam and Balak earlier, so you look at like the key leaders of their nation. Nothing special until we get to a few verses later, the 11th verse, and something weird. And Leonard, it does go on to the next page, so it'll get cut off in the middle. But if you want to go ahead and start this, source number 2, about Og, king of Bashan.
Devarim 3:11. For only Og, king of Bashan, was left from the remnant of the Rephaim. His bedstead was a bedstead of iron. Is it not in Rabbah of the children of Ammon? 9 cubits was its length, 9 cubits was its length, and 4 cubits its breadth, according to the cubit of a man.
Excellent, thank you. So there's quite a few pieces of information here that we learn about this king and the location of where he was, but the two that we're going to focus on, the first one about that he was left over from the Rephaim. Now, that is very explicit. You don't need drash. The Rephaim were talked about earlier in the Torah, and I don't know if anyone can show you with their hand how tall were the Rephaim. It goes outside of the picture. The Rephaim were known as giants. We actually have Emek Rephaim in Israel today, where they, the Valley of the Giants. You could translate it perhaps as spirits in different translations, but the understanding is generally that it means giants. So it says he was descended from the giants, and it's also weird to say that he was left over. Not that his ancestors were, but he was a remainder of them. And then the second thing, and this is what's really wild, and that's what the rabbis are going to pick up on, it talks about his bed and what it's made of and how big it is. That's weird. And you'll see how the rabbis take it, and perhaps the Torah meant for us to take it this way. It says it's arba amot, and an amma is something like my elbow to my arm, which is not terribly long if you have 4 of those. But it says that it's measured in the Hebrew be'amat ish, according to the cubit or amma, this measurement of a man. Now, there are 2 ways that this could be read. It could just mean according to the regular way that you measure things. You know, if we say his bed was 4 feet, according to the way that we count 4 feet or 6 feet or whatever it is, like that. However, the way that we'll see some of the rabbis, actually the first rabbi here, I'll let Ibn Ezra speak for himself. But again, why are we talking about this guy's bed? And what does it mean that he was left over from these Rephaim? So one of the things that at least the next 2 rabbis have in common, Ibn Ezra and Rashbam, who's the grandson of the great Rashi, is they were both known as Pashtanim. You could translate Pashtanim as literalists, but basically what they did is they read the text of the Torah and thought about what does it mean in context? What does it actually say? Putting aside, not to diminish or ignore, but if you put aside rabbinic traditions about how we understand something, what is it actually saying? For example, if the Torah says an eye for an eye, and we didn't have rabbinic tradition, we would say that if somebody, eye for an eye, if you take out someone's eye, they take out your eye. If you injure someone, they take out your eye. Now, rabbinic tradition is very clear. There are actually 10 reasons, I believe the Talmud brings, for why eye for an eye does not mean literally take out someone's eye or cut off someone's hand. But a Pashtan would say, that's fine. Legally, practically, we don't take out someone's eye, but that's what the Torah says. So when they read something in the Torah, they try and tell us, what does the text say? Even if the text is unclear, for scientists, there's Occam's razor, which I may not be defining it perfectly, but essentially, if there's more than one explanation for something, you look for the one that's either the simplest or that explanation or that works the best. If I see a strange light in the sky, one thing is it's aliens, and the other one is it's an airplane or a shooting star or a million other things that are far more likely. And the Pashtans, these literalists, that's what they do. They read the text and say, what's the most likely understanding of what's going on here? But these 2 Pashtanim that sometimes were considered heretics because they read the text so literally or suggested that we take it literally, we're going to see what they do here. So Rita, pardon me a moment, we just have someone else joining us, wonderful. Rita, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And if you would please take from Ibn Ezra, and again, he was brilliant. He was a poet, a grammarian, almost a scientist of his age, brilliant man. But he often got in trouble for, being not progressive as it were, but for using, literal readings of the text and some other suggestions that we'll learn about in another class. So Avraham Ibn Ezra is his full name, 12th century Spain. Go for it, Rita.
Man's cubit, i.e. a normal man's cubit, was indicate that he was twice as an ordinary man's size. It is implausible that sculpture mean his own cubit, because then sculpture would be telling us nothing about his size. And moreover, it would imply that he was not at all shaped like a human being.
Excellent, thank you. So what Ibn Ezra is suggesting here, and again, it's a valid read. It's what makes sense. You don't need to go into midrashic creative territory. Is that by saying a cubit of a man, it's saying that his bed is essentially like person-sized in shape, but multiple people. So be'amat ish in the Hebrew there is suggesting that he's the size of multiple men. So he's clearly much bigger than a regular person. Instead of just saying his bed was 4 amot, which could be 4 or 5 feet or something like that, you'd be like, okay, nothing special about that. Why did we need to know that? It's saying that the way the language can and perhaps should be read is suggesting that it's multiple regular people lengths long. And it's not measuring it based on him. It's measuring him in comparison to other people. And that's the important thing. To say that he wore a helmet that was the size of the helmet of 4 men together, something like that. So his head is 4 times the size of a man. And we'll actually look at a midrash later that suggests that he was even bigger than that. And Rashbam, the grandson of Rashi, also got in trouble a number of times for reading things literally. And again, they didn't suggest that we change Jewish law, or I don't believe they did. But when we read the text, people are very connected to and very insistent that we read in a very particular way according to rabbinic tradition. And the Pashtanim, who there were many of them, which suggests that it's okay to read it literally, we're saying, no, let's actually look at the text. So I'll read this one from Rashbam, and it was talking about these Rephaim, and he said, Kirak Og Melech HaBashan, because he had survived from the time when giants walked the earth. God told Moses not to be afraid of him. So there's 2 things going here. Rashbam is reading this literally and saying that he was a descendant of the giant, but not just he was a descendant of the giant. Sorry, he's not a descendant of the giant. He was one of the giants that were there in the beginning of time. The Rephaim were in the book of Bereshit, the giants who walked around before man, and they were all wiped out, and he was the only one to survive. So Rashbam, again, a literalist, is suggesting here that not only is he a giant, massive, but he's thousands of years old. So there's a question here is what's going on here? And again, it might be that he doesn't have to rely on Drash because the text here is pretty explicit. And one of the things that is often forgotten by those who approach the text with hyper-rationalism and try and do very scientific and say, we reject all this ghost and nonsense and midrashim, is the text of our religion is quite supernatural. The very nature of God, although I guess we would say it's not supernatural, it's natural. God is part of nature, but the idea of things that are beyond our everyday world exists in the Torah. The 10 plagues, etc. Even when people try and explain it and say, no, the plagues are all scientific, there are things that are just amazing in the Torah. And I think these Pashtanim read it and said, we can't explain this any other way except that this is talking about something incredible and it's explicit. Now, one could go and say, no, it's allegorical, and perhaps Maimonides would say that, they're just exaggerating it. But again, the Torah here is pretty explicit. It says he's one of the giants, and his bed is massive. And one of the things that was a debate about a translation is it was either saying where he lived, or the word Rabbah was talking about what his bed was made of. And many, if not most, suggest his bed was made of iron. And again, why would that be? Why would we care? And again, to say that he was so big that if he lay down in a normal bed, like a wooden bed, it would have collapsed beneath him. So this is what happens when you have something just wild in the text. And then this last thing here, this Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher is so important to the development of Jewish law because he wrote the work known as the Arba Turim. He took in 13th century all of Jewish law and created this massive 4-section work of Jewish law. Now that work did not become the standard for all Jewish people, but somebody took that version, took all of the chapter names and developed it into the Shulchan Aruch, which became the standard for Jewish law. But the Shulchan Aruch of Rabbi Yosef Cairo could not have existed without the work of this rabbi, Yaakov ben Asher, and Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher also wrote a commentary on the Torah. So Jane, I am unmuting you, and if you would please take from this Tur HaAruch, and he's going to expand a little bit and talk a little bit about the bed. Go for it, please.
For only Og, the king of Bashan, remained from the remnant of the Rephaim. Nachmanides feels that the message of the verse is that in spite of the fact that at the time Og was the king of Bashan, his origin had been among the Rephaim. In order to suitably impress the reader with the physical dimensions of these Rephaim, of whom Og was typical, the Torah describes the size and raw material that his bed was made of. Any wooden bedstead would have collapsed under his tremendous weight. He lived in a city called Rabbah, which became his capital after the Ammonites had destroyed the Rephaim, including his capital city. He was the only one who had escaped at that time. The purpose of telling us all this is that the Ammonites must have been a very powerful people if they had succeeded in defeating a race of giants of the dimensions of Og. The Israelites are reminded of the historical testimony of the achievements of the Ammonites down to their own period.
Excellent. One interesting side point, by the way, a lot of these measurements, we're not 100% sure what they are. We know they're, a lot. He was very tall, but we also have basketball players today who are exceptionally tall. So for a people who might be an average of, 5'5", and then a city of people who are 6'7", like my father-in-law is well over 6 feet, he would be a giant to them. So even though I suggested here that this is quite wild, there are certainly rational explanations for it. However, what the Torah Aruch adds in here is that the Torah is emphasizing that from the perspective of all the other nations, the Israelites, and certainly this other nation, Ammon, who the Israelites then defeated, is that the nation of the Rephaim, and then Og himself, looked massive and mighty and terrifying. And we know from the sin of the Meraglim, of the scouts, the spies, that what they said is, in the eyes of the people of the land of Canaan, we are but grasshoppers. They are like giants to us. So whether or not this is taken literally, experientially, this is so important. If a nation goes and says, the enemy is massive, they're huge in number and size, and we can't defeat them, of course they're going to lose. If the Israelites approach that, and we saw earlier, I think in Ibn Ezra, he said that the reason God was emphasizing this was not to scare the people, but to ensure them that even though they're massive and big and scary, God will still allow them to win. There is no enemy too big that you cannot defeat with God's help. But again, this idea that no matter how mighty they are, Israelite can overcome them if they are brave. Now, what that led to is a beautiful midrash that will conclude this first section. But what's interesting is the way this midrash is introduced and talked about is that many midrashim, many of these stories the rabbis give, are based on textual hints, meaning an extra letter or an extra word or something that's so unclear that can be read in 2 or 3 ways that can then create a creative spark for someone to go off on. And oftentimes they also, so basically there's some basis in the text for it. Even if it's a wild midrash, they could say, well, this midrash makes sort of sense. It's possible because you could read the word backwards. But when they get to this midrash, they say explicitly in a number of places, there's no textual basis for this. We know that Og, the king of Bashan, is big, but what's going to happen in this midrash, there's nothing whatsoever in the text that hints that this happened. This is purely a tradition that has been passed down, but the moral lesson that they develop out of it, which is one of the most important and powerful things that the Talmud gives, is just beautiful. So Gloria, and again, this will go on to the next page, if you would take source number 6, this incredible story about Og and the people overcoming him.
With regard to the rock that Og, king of Bashan, sought to throw upon Israel, there is no biblical reference, but rather a tradition was transmitted. The Gemara relates that Og said, "How large is the camp of Israel? It is 3 parasangs. I will go and uproot a mountain 3 parasangs long, and I will hurl it upon them and kill them."
Excellent. Before you go on, so in the Hebrew it's parseh, which I think is because it's connected, I believe, and I read this, is that it's connected to a Persian measurement, but a parasang, or a parsang if you're British, is something like 3 miles. So 3 parasangs would be something like 9 miles. So it makes sense to say that the Israelites, their encampment goes out 9 miles or so. That's pretty big, but that's not, impossible. But he decided to pick up a mountain range that was 9 miles long. So obviously this is not meant to be taken literally, but again, what happens next is just so powerful. So go ahead, Gloria.
He went, uprooted a mountain 3 parasangs long, and brought it on his head. And the Holy One, blessed be he, brought grasshoppers.
Go ahead.
Brought grasshoppers upon it, and they pierced the peak of the mountain, and it fell on his neck. Og wanted to remove it from his head. His teeth were extended to one side of his head and to the other, and he was unable to remove it. And that is what is written: you break the teeth of the wicked.
Excellent, thank you. So there are a number of beautiful pieces of imagery here. I'll start with the last one. The line from Psalms, from Tehillim, and you break the teeth of the wicked, they obviously take out of context there, but it's about us defeating our enemies. And what it says is, once he was crushed by this rock, essentially the mountain was, he held it up over his head, and these grasshoppers caused it to fall on him. And the reason he couldn't get it off, what does it mean his teeth were out to his side, is think of the image of a villain in a movie, and they have sharp teeth, they've sharpened their teeth, and it's this imagery of someone who's just monstrous. And what this midrash is telling us is that his wickedness had so overcome him that any kind of internal bravery or strength was gone. There was nothing left in him but cruelty. His cruelty had overcome him, and he no longer had strength to lift the mountain because there was nothing left. There was no man, there was no strength, there was no mighty giant. It was all sharp teeth and monstrosity. And because of that, his teeth being broken, he was defeated. He had nothing left to give. Whereas someone who's brave and fighting for a good purpose, they'll always find hidden strength. He had nothing left. He was just a wild animal, a beast. But the first part is really beautiful, is grasshoppers. Now, again, it's a midrash, but what literally happened in the Torah is that the Israelites overcame Og and his whole nation of Bashan and totally defeated them. But in this image here, he's this massive giant with a massive mountain over his head. And the one that defeated is not another giant, but grasshoppers. And as I mentioned earlier, who saw themselves as tiny, insignificant grasshoppers is the Israelites. And they originally took it as a weakness. We are tiny grasshoppers. What can we do against giants? And you're right. If you're walking in the street, even the average person who's 5'5", 5'6", and there's a grasshopper, they can easily take their foot and crush that grasshopper, which don't do that. But if there's 10,000 grasshoppers all working in conjunction, besides that being terrifying, an Alfred Hitchcock level, movie, if they all work together, their might is unstoppable. And the message here is that if all Israel works together, their strength is far greater than any giant in any mountain. He can lift a mountain, they can destroy a mountain. They can just wipe it out completely. That's such a powerful message, is when we are alone, we are grasshoppers. When we are together, we are so powerful and we can accomplish anything. If I sometimes say, if there's one takeaway message, and that would be mine for today, is alone, we are often weak, but together as a community, as a city, as a nation, as a world, if we work together, imagine how mighty we can be. And not just metaphorically, if the whole world actually started to work together, which I believe one day, God willing, will happen, imagine what we can accomplish. But when we're so divided, see how easy it is to pick us off. And I want to end this section with this beautiful teaching from the Mishnah, the section Pirkei Avot from the Rabbinic Wisdom. And it talks about, it's a chapter that talks about, the ideal kind of person. What are the attributes of a good person who controls their anger, etc.? And here, Ben Zoma Omer, Ezehu Chacham. Who is the person that is wise? And it says, one who learns from every person. As it is said, from all my teachers have I gained understanding. Is recognizing that true knowledge is not, I figure it out and learn it on my own. It's, I'm part of a greater community. And if I take wisdom from everyone, then what I can accomplish intellectually is absolutely amazing. And it continues, who is mighty? Ezehu Gibor, who is the one who has great strength? One who conquers their impulse to evil. As it is written, one who is slow to anger is better than the Almighty, and one who rules over their spirit than one who conquers a city. And here you could say that it's both about someone who controls their anger, but also somebody who quashes their ego. And instead of attacking other people, works with other people. And that's true, again, somebody who learns from and works with everyone, what they can accomplish is so much greater than what they can do alone. So I'm going to pause there before we go on to the summary for the final section and ask, are there any questions up until now? And again, just throw up your hand. Yeah, Rita, I'm going to unmute you, and then I can have you read.
I have a question.
Please.
How Og survived the flood? He was tall enough to be above the water?
So I could be confusing these midrashim. There is a midrash where there was a giant who was hanging onto the side of Noah's Ark. you have to, I could easily double check. Someone could, in fact, if anyone's on their computer right now and wants to try and Google that and type in giant hanging on side of Noah's Ark, and if it was Og, then that's an easy answer to your question. Again, this is all Midrash. Well, it's interesting. This is Midrashic territory, except your question is apt because it says he was left over from the Rephaim, who, as you pointed out, were there before the flood. Now, the way that the Torah Aruch explains it, quoting Ramban, who, while Ramban, Nachmanides, often brings in mystical text, is a literalist and a Pashtan in many cases, he says his origins were in the Rephaim. So maybe one could say, no, he didn't literally survive it. It's, somehow it was genetic. Yeah, it's a good question unless we go into Midrashic territory. So if anyone, while we're going through the last section, wants to try and Google and see if Og is the one who hung on to the side of the boat with the dinosaurs, of course, I'm kidding, then that would be a good answer to your question, even though it relies on Midrash. But as I said, there are things that are beyond us in the Torah, but it's a very apt question. And there may be, again, more answers to your question that are better than I'm saying. And if anyone finds that, feel free to share it at the end of class. But for now, will I have you read it? So this is a summary. It's from My Jewish Learning, again, an amazing website. And they summarize the Haftorah. And again, it's specifically for this Shabbat, known as Shabbat Chazon, Shabbat of this vision that Isaiah, the prophet, is giving to the people. And it is a prophecy of doom. The book of Isaiah has a great deal of hope and opportunities for repentance. But this particular week is meant to prepare us for the tragic day next week of the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av. So Rita, if you want to go ahead, and maybe we'll split this up, but if you want to go ahead and start, Tisha B'Av, the saddest day.
Tisha B'Av, the saddest day on the Jewish calendar, marks the anniversary of the destruction of the temple. On the Shabbat before Tisha B'Av, which always coincides with Parasha Devarim, Jews read the Haftarah from the beginning of the book of Isaiah. The Shabbat before Tisha B'Av is often called Shabbat Chazon, named after the first word of the Haftarah. Unlike Jeremiah and Ezekiel, who both experienced vivid vision as their initiation into prophecy, Isaiah does not report heavenly visions. He simply begins by condemning the people of Judah and Jerusalem for their poor behavior.
And so you see here that he does have visions at some point, but here he jumps right into rebuking the people, and which also teaches us that the job of a prophet is not just to have visions and tell us and to see the future, but it's also to teach the people and guide them, and that is just as important. And clearly, God wanted him to do so. But it's not just about wild visions; it's also about teaching and educating the people. So, I'll have you take, if it's okay, Rita, one more paragraph. He reminds
the people that God has been like a father to them, and instead of being grateful and respectful for all that He has done for them, the people continue to rebel and spurn God's authority. Then they sin, they are punished. Yet instead of learning from their mistakes, the people continue to do wrong. Even the land they live on is penalized for their insidious behavior. Isaiah tells the people that God no longer has any interest in the sacrifices that the people have been bringing to Him. Though they obediently gather in the temple on holidays and at the beginning of every month, their lack of social justice nullifies any rewards they may get for offering gifts to God.
Excellent, thank you. So there's a few powerful messages in here. One is that God always opens the door for us to repent constantly, and unfortunately the people, and again, we've learned a little bit about the prophet Isaiah, and in fact, starting this coming Tuesday, we're going to have a 3-week on our Tuesday evening sessions, talk about 3 different prophets, and they'll all have somewhat similar messages and explanations for why the people turn away from God. They became rich, they became lazy, they became complacent in thinking that they were mighty, but for whatever reason, they ignored the prophet. And while I'm not suggesting that we should follow every prophet, anyone here who's been on a metro, the subway in New York, when I went to school sometimes, there was a guy and he'd be screaming, "You're all going to burn, you've all turned away from God." And if I thought I could have a a good conversation with him. I probably, at least as a religious person, agree with a lot of what he says, but I generally try to tune him out, as do most people. But today we're like, oh, well, those people are crazy, which I don't know that they're necessarily crazy, but that's what happened to Isaiah. They said, this guy is crazy. Why should we listen to him? All the signs are pointing elsewhere. And in fact, there were often other prophets who were saying the opposite thing. So it's not even like there was one prophet that people could choose to ignore or not. There were multiple different voices. So it was very confusing, but the people kept turning away from God. And Isaiah said to them, all the things you're doing, the holidays, the sacrifices, he didn't say stop doing them. He didn't say throw out Jewish law. What he said was it's losing meaning, because when you go out and you cheat people and kill people and violate people and then come in and bring a sacrifice, okay, technically you brought a sacrifice, but that's not the point of it. God doesn't want you to bring a sacrifice just as a rote activity. God wants it to come from the people who are bringing God's word down to earth, or who are bringing justice to the world. They are supposed to be a physical act symbolizing the godly lives that we live. We live a life of law and of justice and morality, and then we reflect that by showing our gratitude to God. Well, all the people are doing is slaughtering animals. There's no gratitude. There's nothing else good connected there. And then the final part here is the Haftorah progresses. Isaiah's rage wanes slightly. And as I said, even though this is very, doom-mongering as it were, there's a great deal of hope, because there is always hope. God always wants there to be hope. It's part of us having free will, and reward and punishment. There always has to be a chance to better ourselves. He tells the people to change their behavior, learn to do good, devote yourselves to justice, aid the wrong, uphold the rights of the orphan, defend the cause of the widow, and promises that they will be rewarded with a bountiful harvest. So if they do good, good will happen. In the closing section of the Haftorah, Isaiah laments the downfall of Judah and Jerusalem. So he recognized that it's very likely to happen. The writing is on the wall. The destitution of Zion, Sion, and the injustice that is rampant. But Isaiah promises that God's anger will be abated, and there is a hint of hope for the future. Zion shall be saved in the judgment, his repentant ones in the retribution. And we saw this, of course, in the rebuilding of the Second Temple. And then those prophets and writers and people who were there also had hope, and the rabbis of the Talmud, that a third temple would be rebuilt. But we haven't rebuilt the third temple yet. Hope has come back. It's been, 60 years now at least. We have the land of Israel again, but there is always hope, no matter how far down we go. And that speaks not only to our religious journey and our history, but for anybody, no matter how far we fall. There's always hope that both God and our community and ourselves can lift up again, but ultimately it's in our hands. And that's so powerful. The benefit to the plus, the minus of free will is that our actions can doom us, but our actions can also save us. And God will support us by appropriate consequences when we doom ourselves, but God will always save us when we turn to him and we have good action. And that is the way that we should approach the 9th of Av, is that we ultimately brought this history on ourselves, but we can also create a better history for ourselves through good actions and justice. I'm going to pause there, but before I take down the sources, I just wanted to ask if anyone was able to find that midrash I mentioned. Jane, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And who was it that hung on to the side of the ark?
So it is Og. I found a reference in the Jewish Encyclopedia to Nida 61a, and then Rashi responding to that he was not, that the waters reached only to his ankles. And then there's another thought that a third legend said that another tradition states that he fled to Palestine where there was no flood, that Rashi said that, and a third legend that he sat on a rung of a ladder outside the ark. And after he had sworn to be a slave to Noah and his children, received his food each day through a hole made in the side of the ark.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Shane. So Rita, that's, again, it's midrashic territory, but those are several possible answers to your question about how he survived. And the reason I knew that story is not because I've memorized all of Judaism, it's just such a wild story. I'm not even sure where I first learned it. But Jane, thank you so much for that.